Accra, the Central. Welcome to another thought-provoking MADI e-conference. Today we will continue with the second segment of our deliberations on the new EU law or regulation on conflict minerals. How significant is this law to Africa's mineral sector? How does it impact Africa, and how do we integrate it into Africa's mineral value chain? What are the challenges associated with this new EU regulation? And I ask again, should we imbibe it? Should we ignore it? What are the ramifications if we choose either option? Some scholars are of the opinion that the African mining vision, for example, hasn't been able to take off as expected or as planned because of some background machinations and apparent contest for operability by the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. Those scholars believe that EITI was mainly established to monitor and remotely manage Africa's natural resource. Indeed, 48%, that is almost half of the 54 countries in EITI are in Africa. Would you therefore agree with them that EITI was predominantly established for Africa? I ask you. So we as a people survived COVID-19 in 2020, only to enter 2021 to meet a new EU law on conflict minerals. Look at it this way. On January 1, 2021, the European Union brought a conflict mineral regulation into force. The regulation brings changes to businesses in the EU that import minerals or metals, as well as those that smelt or refine such minerals, and even those engaged in the due diligence schemes of such mineral businesses. Let's assume that it's an EU law, but as you well know, an estimated third of the world's known mineral resource reserves are located in Africa. So why is the African Union, for example, not proactively spearheading a similar philosophy for Africa? While the new EU conflict minerals law entered into force on January 1st, 2021, on this very same day, Africa commenced trading under the African Continental Free Trade Area. The African Continental Free Trade Area is the largest in terms of volume or size single free trade area since the WTO. It provides a large market as well as a fundamental industrial base for Africa's industrialization drive. Now, is it just a coincidence that these two events, and I'm talking about the EU law on conflict minerals and the commencement of trading under AFTA, should occur on the same day? In any case, does an EU law on conflict minerals affect you as an individual, regardless of where you are? How does it affect us as a continent? How does it affect the existing supply chain of these 3 TG minerals, minerals that have been tagged conflict minerals? In the first segment of our discussion on this new EU law on conflict minerals on February 18, 2021, Professor Nelly Mutemeri of the University of Witwatersrand queried the process that led to the formulation of this new EU law, which are mainly on minerals found in Africa. She asks whether it was also another story of the Dodd-Frank Act, which didn't consult or elicit input from African shareholders. Well, today, we'll continue with the discussion and pay some attention to the way forward and also the associated challenges. Today's e-conference will also be in 3 parts. There will be presentation by Lloyd Head, a researcher at the International Peace Information Services, and she's also a vice chair of the multi-stakeholder initiative and of the European Internship for Responsible Minerals. We'll also have presentation from Joseph Okedi, who is the Assistant Commissioner, Ministry of Energy and Mineral Development at the Directorate of Geological Surveys in Uganda. We'll also listen to Samuel Agbo Tabi, who is the President of Central Africa Mining Association. We'll also have presentation from Richard Athenu, who is a former director at the Minerals Commission of Ghana and also at the Ministry of Lands and Natural Resources. There will also be input made from the MADI board chair, Dr. Frank Dixon Mujani, and also the MADI CEO, Nancy Awori. There will be a panel discussion session by Jeffrey Rhodes and Gerhard Schubert. Jeffrey is the founder and managing consultant at Rhodes Precious Metals and Consultancy, and Gerhard is the founder and principal of Schubert Commodities Consultancy. We recall that the two have called on Africa to save her natural resources by letting their respective central banks purchase 10% for posterity and also for the firm. Then the microphone will be made available to all during a Q&A session. With that, I welcome you to part 2 of the e-conference on conflict minerals. At this juncture, I'd like to cede the mic to Dr. Frank Dixon Mujani, the chairman of the board of directors of the Minerals Africa Development Institution, to set the stage with his opening statement. Dr. Mujani, our participants.
Thank you, Raymond, for that introduction. You actually have set the stage much better than I can do. I think you have put some questions that would lead our discussions so well. Before I do my remarks, let's remember our late President John Pombe Joseph Magufuli, who passed on very recently. And it is really very important for us to remember John Pombe Joseph Magufuli, because within the mineral resource sector, he left something that we need to learn from. And we, as African Union, we may have to take a leaf on his policies or policy reform on mineral resource sector. Whether it was a pragmatic or a resource nationalism or something that was just being pushed by populism or something like whatever it was, but it is a very significant rethink of Africa in terms of how we review our mineral resources. I think we all remember the case between Tanzania and Acacia, and of course what followed later on, the Tanzanians' reviews of the laws and having to restrict importation of raw materials and having to add value and so forth. So, and the joint ventures that followed thereafter between mining companies and the government. And we remember the highest, the biggest miner who discovered a Tanzanite and became a millionaire in one day, who was an artisanal small-scale mining, is because of the law that Magufuli put in place, that probably led to this miner from nowhere that, one day woke up having mined a stone that made him a billionaire in terms of international level. So we remember our late president, may he rest in peace, but let's proceed with this meeting. Thanks again for our participants who are coming on. Thanks for the presenters who have offered time to present on this meeting, and our panelists and discussants, Jeffrey and his colleague. Thanks the organizers, Raymond, Madam Nancy, CEO, and the team. Now, I want to put my submission, as I said, to the stage, based on two things. That we as Africa, and I recently gave a talk on the private sector summit under the CFTA. And there was the theme that was being discussed was Africa righting the wrongs, righting not as in right, but putting right the wrongs that we have made in the past, righting the wrongs for us to achieve sustainable development. And this one is in line with the Agenda 2063, because the Agenda 2063 says that Africa must learn from its past to forge the future. We need to learn to look at what has been the past, what is the present, and what we need to achieve in the future. Then we need to look at whether Africa should have an independence of thought while learning from best practices around the world in order to put the laws, regulations, and policies in place that will help Africa move forward. And indeed, Ray asked whether African Union shouldn't also have a law like the EU law on conflict minerals. And indeed, in 2016, in Kigali, the heads of state and government asked the African Union to develop a model law that will assist or will help Africa achieve development using its mineral resources. And I'm happy to inform you that Nancy, and I did inform the gathering on the last meeting, that Nancy Awori, who is MADI CEO, is the lead expert on the development of the model law. And I'm sure once it is concluded, whatever we are discussing as MADI through these forums will actually inform the African Union model law. Now, righting the wrongs. What are the wrongs? What do we need to write, to put right for us to forge? Time immemorial, and what we are discussing here is that we're discussing an EU law. It's not an African law. It's not something that we should really be discussing, because it's an EU law. Every region has got to have a law. Every country needs to have a law. Americans have laws. Even the American states have laws. Even UK has laws. Even the Scottish government has laws. They have their own government. The Welsh government has laws. So Africa, we need to look at whether we have an independence of thought in how we do our work. We are discussing an EU law. And why are we discussing an EU law? Because it will affect Africa. And why will it affect Africa? Because Africa is not prepared, or we don't have a counter law, or we don't have a parallel law, or we don't have any law or regulation that will ensure that either the EU law works well for Africa, or we encounter and discuss from within the African perspective, what that law will impact on Africa, and then we engage in a frank dialogue with the EU to say it will work or it will not work. This meeting today, as opposed to the last one, is going to be discussing how to implement the recommendations. How do we not just keep on talking, but how do we ensure that the recommendations that we put in place are implemented? And in these recommendations, we'll hire some of the recommendations from the EU side. The EU has recommendations that they have put in place, that EU law, which came into effect on 1st of January. If it has to work, then these are the recommendations. Will that recommendations of the EU support African development? Possibly yes, possibly no, possibly half-half. We already know some of the laws, for instance, in EU on illegal and unreported and unregulated fishing. They have the laws. If they catch a ship that is fishing illegally in the waters of Africa, the EU will penalize that company. And similarly, if a company is actually caught within the EU law as, as abusing the law, the EU law on conflict minerals, it will be penalized. But will that help Africa? If the company is fined millions of dollars for having abrogated the law, will that help us remove conflict minerals? So we as Africans, we need to look at how do we ensure that we take all the criticisms that have made on Africa, negative and positive. In fact, I'm going to be, I'm not going to cover up by saying that, including the harsh comment by the ex-president of America. We just have to pick whatever it was said about Africa and see what we need to learn from. There are positive criticisms. And at the last meeting, one journalist wanted to have an interview with me, and I was engaging with her on what MADI is all about, that we believe in an African voice. We want to push for Africa. And I was asked the question whether the speakers or our panelists are friends of Africa. And my answer was that all our speakers and everybody in the world who is interested in Africa, positively or negatively, or whether to mine or to trade or to do whatever, including the time of slave trade, has an interest in Africa. And for us, everybody is a friend of Africa. It is us as Africans to know whom do we work with, whom don't we work with. But everybody who wants everything from Africa can be our friend, not an enemy, because we want to trade. At our inaugural conference in July, one of our speakers, Musa Mabuza from South Africa, ended his presentation by saying Africa has what the rest of the world wants, and the rest of the world has what Africa wants. We need to find a way of how do we use these two to actually benefit, so that the benefits are mutual, not skewed to one side. So as Africans, we need to put our house in order. And that's why the Minerals Africa Development Institution is here to look at how do we develop solutions that are for Africa, for development of Africa, not for development in Africa, because we have two different types of developments. You hear a company having about 14 mining companies in Africa, in gold. You have others having so many other companies of investing in Africa, but Africa is still poor. They'll tell you it's still poor. Whether the definition is right or wrong, but we still have that poverty. So there is this paradox of Africa living with a vast of mineral resources endowments, with the majority of her people living in abject poverty. So there is development. They will tell you we have attract investment into your territory, put the laws that are good, conducive for attracting investment, put a conducive environment for attracting investment. But then companies come and invest and you remain poor. And you ask yourself, why is it happening? So that's development in your country, not for your country. You are still struggling to do the roads, to put schools, to give the public good. You can't afford to offer health services. You can't afford to offer education services. You can't afford to offer infrastructure, energy, all these services, utilities that the human life wants to live, life, shelter, and education and food. We don't have at our disposal. Our governments cannot offer that. One time Nyerere asked a question, the late President Nyerere asked a question in terms of us paying our debts back to the World Bank, whether we should pay our debts when our people are struggling and suffering, or we should default on these debts so as to pay for our debts. But again, you ask yourself, why should Africa look for handouts? You ask yourself, why, if a country has got all these mineral resources, and in terms of the recent study under Thabo Mbeki leadership, discovered that over $100 billion is leaving Africa in illicit financial flows. This has both arguments, others saying, no, it shouldn't be right, others saying it should be, no, illicit flows. And 70% is in what people call extractive industries. I call it mineral resource sector, because I believe that extractive is extraction. Mineral resource development is for sustainable development. If you look at mineral resources, as opposed to extractive industries, because in my personal, my vocabulary and my dictionary, I don't have extractive industries. I look at the mineral resource development, because we need to look at value chains. So you ask yourself, if we are losing all this amount of money, why are we still looking for aid? The answer is we have not been able to diligently manage or put governance framework in place to manage our resources. And you can't blame one side. And there is no way, and I said we receive this constructive criticism constructively. We as Africans are contributing. The book that was discovered, this amount of hemorrhage, says the 10% of that 100 billion could be more, and that is only in mineral resource sector. It's not in illicit fishing. Is because of corruption of public and government officials that leads to the 70% that goes. And it's simple. If you get $1 and you're compromised by $1, the person who compromises with $1 takes away $10. He's not compromising you for $1 to take away $1. No, you're being compromised. So Africa, we have to put our house in order, because we cannot just feel shy. We cannot, ditch our heads in the sand and say, no, everything is okay. We have to proceed. So if we have to put our house in order, this meeting is one to have, how do we have a frank dialogue in order to ensure that the EU law on conflict minerals, which is put in place with good intentions of ensuring that the mineral resources in Africa don't contribute to conflicts. That's with good intentions. We need to have responsible sourcing to ensure that the monies, the arms that goes into this sector doesn't lead into human rights abuses, the domestic violence and child abuses and so forth and so forth. But what have we as Africans done to actually ensure that the conflict shouldn't even be there in the first place? Because if the conflicts are not there, there is no conflict law. If the conflicts are not there are no conflict minerals. So there shouldn't be conflict minerals, because conflict minerals is not an international definition of mineral resources. It's a classic definition for resources found in areas of conflict in Africa, not in Brazil, not in Argentina, not anywhere else, not even in Afghanistan, not in Syria, not in Libya, not in Iraq, but in Africa. There are conflicts all over the world. When I arrived in London in 1989, sometimes we could not take trains because they were expecting bomb shells and so forth and so forth. There was a conflict. But people were trading. People trade during the time of wars. And within Africa, we even have some of the trading regimes that cannot allow us to trade in our arms. EBA, everything but arms, for instance. You can export everything to Europe, but not arms. Yet we have the capacity and the potential to produce bullets from copper, cobalt. I mean, from element to produce a tank. We have all the iron ore. So our minerals can actually feed into an arms or value chain. Someone wants to put a value chain of arms production in Africa, can actually use our resources, but you won't sell them to the rest of the world. But these people in these enclaves where these conflict minerals are importing guns and bullets and other things, and in exchange of our resources. And we as Africans want to blame someone else? No, we can't, because it's our own, it's on us. The onus is on us as Africans to put our house in order. So in this conference for today, let's look at reasonable recommendations and how do we put them together. But for me, from the African side, it's not about Africa should engage with the European when the Europeans are putting their laws, that we consult Africa. No, Africa should have its own law. No, why don't they call Americans to come and engage with us on our law, how to trade with you? Why should we blame Europeans not having engaged Africa in developing a law that is going to affect Africa? Because we don't have our own law. Why don't we develop our own law? The moderator said, extractive industries initiative started when I was in London, under Tony Blair's regime. And what was it looking for? Because there were these, accusations of Africa not benefiting from its resources, and the finger was pointing to the rest, to the outside, when the three fingers are pointing to us as Africans. Then we have now CONEX project in Germany that is supposed to help Africans learn how to negotiate prudent contracts. I mean, come on. Do we need to grant to G7 to give us a CONEX project based in German for us to know how to negotiate prudent contracts in Africa? My answer is definitely no. We need to understand, as Africa, we have lawyers, we have economists, we have those who can understand even the future trading of commodities, to know that the price of this commodity today is this, and the price of this commodity in 10 years will be this, or 5 years, these projections, and therefore this agreement shouldn't be good for you at this current price, which are very low. The case at hand is when Zambia sold its copper mines in the early 90s, when the price of copper was very low. Eventually, when they wanted to argue for a windfall tax, they were taken to court. So we as Africans, we need to look at the recommendation. We need to look at these laws, not in conflict, but in understanding how do we learn from how EU put this law. It's there, it's in force, it's going to affect us. It's going to affect Africa in two ways. One is our artisan and small-scale miners cannot manage to work around this EU law if they have to import their products to EU. So they will need help. How do we find a way of helping them to do that? Two, the under African Continental Free Trade Area, there are going to be regional value chains. Some commodities, as we move along in 5 years, 10 years, whatever, Africa, probably there will be some regional value chains that will be involved in these mineral resources. And they produce products. And when they produce that products, whether intermediary goods or final goods, but they have added value to some of these products in Africa, and they want to access European market. And the question would be, what was your responsible sourcing? So what we need to do is find a solution. And the solution is to ensure that there is mutual benefit for everybody. For those who will be involved, the private sector, the non-state actors, the citizens, the communities, as most of the people call them. I call them the citizenry, because I believe the communities are communities, and the citizens, they want public good. They want to be serviced with, they want to send their children to school. They want to have good universities. They want to have, and then how does it also benefit governments? Private sector, basic governments, citizens, and the artisanal, the small and medium enterprises in Africa. because there are small and medium enterprises in the mineral resource sector trying to produce goods that they may want to export, but not knowing that they cannot actually meet the standards of that market under the EU law. So as we discuss through this, this is my humble submission that let's look inwards as Africans, find solutions that will assist us as Africa to achieve the visions of our forefathers, the vision of African Union, the vision of our Abuja Treaty, the vision of the Lagos Plan of Action. Now, the vision enshrined in Agenda 2063. How do we achieve them? Otherwise, we shall have visions piled after visions, and we will not have benefits. So let's reflect on that, and then we should be able to get good results. I want to thank again our presenters that are coming on. I want to thank the moderator, Raymond, and the organizers, and I wish you fruitful deliberations. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mujeni, for setting the stage for today's program. I am particularly glad to hear that there is an EU law to benefit us in the same direction. I'm also happy to hear that statement you made that Africa has what the rest of the world wants, and the rest of the world wants what Africa has. And you also pointed out the difference between development for Africa or of Africa, and then development in Africa. That was a great stage setter. Well, to have a continuity between what we did the first part of this conference and then what we're about to receive now, we'll call on our CEO, the CEO of MADI, Madam Nancy Awori, to give us a brief presentation for that link to occur. So I would hand over to Madam CEO, the audience and participants.
Thank you very much, Raymond, and thank you to our chairman who has just spoken. Before I make my presentation, I would like to take this opportunity to welcome all of you who have joined us for this e-conference. I know that most of you are also part of the first e-conference. So because this conference is to concretize on the recommendations that were made in the first e-conference, we thought we should give a summary of the issues that were discussed and some of the recommendations that were made. I'm going to be very brief because in this meeting, we want to concentrate more on the discussions and coming up with concrete solutions and probably projects that we can undertake to implement those recommendations. I've shared my presentation on the group chat. I hope you can access. Unfortunately, we can't show the presentations. We can't share a screen because we've had previous incidences of hackers when we share the slideshows. So please follow from what I've shared on the chat. So our MADI held its first e-conference on 18th February under the same theme as this one. And the objectives of that conference was to establish how the EU regulation will affect the producers in Africa, and especially focusing on artisan and small-scale miners, because the majority of Africans participate in the ASM subsector. And several issues were discussed in that e-conference, including a detailed overview of the EU regulation and its likely impact on producer countries. We looked at policies, laws, and regulations for responsible sourcing in Africa, and the case study here was in Uganda. I'm happy that we have another presenter today from the Directorate of Geological Surveys who will expand on what we looked at last week. We also looked at the likely impact of responsible sourcing regulations on accessing ASM gold by refineries in Africa, how to mitigate the impact, and also getting possible solution. And here, there was a case that was made for establishment of an Africa Precious Minerals and Metals Association. Today, we want to find a roadmap. How can we make that association a reality after having it discussed in these two conferences? So we hope that from today's meeting, we'll come up with a roadmap on how we can work on establishing that association with the partners who are interested. We also looked at how the regulations are expected to impact domestic and regional mining sectors. And here we noticed that so far, the main initiative that has been done in Africa is under the ICGLR. And again, today, the representative, the presenter from Uganda is also a representative of Uganda on the ICGLR. So we'll get more on that. We looked at whether these regulations have been well communicated in Africa and how has it influenced decisions. We also looked at what these regulations mean for the implementation of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. And I already talked about the association. So just briefly, because some members were not, didn't attend the first conference, just to give a brief overview of the EU regulations. The regulations came into effect on 1st January 2021, and it affects mainly four minerals. That's gold, tungsten, tin, and tantalum. And it requires that EU importers of those metals and minerals to ensure that they only use responsible and conflict-free sources. And the aim and implications of these regulations is to ensure that EU importers of the 3 TGs meet international responsible sourcing standards set by the OECD, ensure that global and EU smelters and refiners of the 3 TGs source responsibly, help break the link between conflict and the illegal exploitation of minerals, help to put an end to the exploitation and abuse of local communities, including mine workers, and support to local development by applying the by local development. Also, the regulations set out by applying the regulations set out in the document called the Due Diligence Guidance for Responsible Supply of Minerals from Conflict-Affected and High-Risk Areas. To meet the regulatory requirements, EU importers of these minerals are required to establish strong company management systems, Boyan, could you please mute that person?
Les équipes sont prêtes. Chacun n'a qu'à s'engager dans le sens où il peut apporter sa contribution, peu importe la façon dont il peut l'apporter. Donc, aujourd'hui, on va se prononcer. Et demain, quand on commence, ce n'est pas pour qui. Donc, vraiment,
I'm trying.
À travers des conseils, à travers de tout ça, là, ils peuvent le faire, mais je crois qu'il n'est plus question de continuer à douter.
Okay, Nancy.
Okay, please proceed. Removed. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Boyan, and sorry for that interruption. So the companies to set up management systems, identify and assess risks in their supply chains, design and implement a strategy to respond to identified risks, carry out an independent third-party audit of supply chain due diligence, and report annually on supply chain due diligence. The EU hopes that these obligations will help prevent money from reaching armed groups and criminals and bring an end to exploitation and abuse of local communities. The EU, the regulations also, there's a list as of December. The EU has a list of about 7 countries, and the bulk of these countries are in Africa. And again, the bulk of the countries in Africa are within the Great Lakes region, which covers DRC and the neighboring countries. And these are also the same countries that form part of the ACGLR, at least 10 of them. I'll move to the main issues that were identified during the first key conference. And one of them is that it's at the level of the producing countries that capacities and awareness of these regulations are vital. It should be noted that in most of these initiatives that are put in place by importer or consumer countries, Africa is never consulted. So we are just consumers of the regulations as well. So a lot of capacity building and awareness is required for the producer countries, right from policymakers to implementers to the miners themselves. Also, that the EU has paid little attention in preparing the producer countries. So these regulations came into force on January, but if you went and asked the policymakers in these producer countries, most of them may not be aware of the impact or the likely impact of these regulations on their mining sector. The other issue that was identified was that all sectors in the mineral supply chain may be at risk of contributing to an adverse impact on the mineral trade, regardless of their position in the supply chain. And these risks may include serious human rights abuses and provide direct and indirect support to non-state armed groups or to public or private security. So regardless of the position on the value chain, the supply chain, different players have the capacity of contributing to this conflict. And then also that there's a risk of economic disengagement from countries that are listed. So when these countries are put on the list, many importers may be scared of going into those countries because of the added costs that are involved in complying with the regulation. The other issue is that there's a potential risk that the regulations may encourage companies in sourcing from large companies, because it's going to be very hard for ASMs to put in place systems that can actually meet the requirements of the EU regulations. So this might affect the market for the ASMs, and this is the biggest subsector where most Africans participate. Also, and it's the same that the regulations risk favoring large-scale miners in producing countries as they may have better capacities to comply with the new requirements. And yet, ASM sector is hugely important to Africa. It's therefore important that both the producer countries and the AU come out of this implementation of this regulation. Also, producer governments have a role to ensure transparent production chains at the upstream level, including through the formalization of ASM sector. And because if the sector is formalized, then probably they will be more prepared to meet the requirements of the regulations. There's also need for the producer countries within Africa to harmonize taxes to reduce incentives for smuggling. I will now go to the recommendations that were made. There are several issues, but since you have the presentations, I will skip most of them and go to the recommendations that were made. So if you look at slide 18, provides for the recommendations that were made during the first conference. And one was a proposal for the establishment of the African Precious Minerals and Metals Association as a process towards developing an African regulation for precious minerals, under which the 3 TGs fall. There's also need to establish how the EU regulations complement and build on local regulations and regulatory requirements. There's need for urgent capacity building and support for both ASMs and policymakers. Africa needs to come up with its own certification mechanism and a solution to managing conflict minerals, e.g., other countries can replicate what has been done under the ICGLR, or better still, AU may need to recognize and support ICGLR so it can work in other areas as well, other regions of Africa. Africa producer countries need to prepare for the implementation of and also find mechanisms to mitigate the risks associated with the new regulations. There's need to assess areas of capacity building, address the issues around lack of national administration and certification initiatives. Then there's also need to provide technical and research support and support to regional certification schemes such as the ICGLR and producer countries in good extractive governance. Those were the recommendations that I've managed to capture. So today's conference is to concretize on those recommendations, and hopefully we leave here with solutions on which programs and activities can be undertaken to implement those recommendations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam CEO, for bringing in that historic, historic element from the conference, from conflict minerals 1, moving us into conflict minerals 2. With that setting the stage, we will go to the next speaker, who is Ms. Loite Hicks. She's a researcher at the International Peace Information Services, IPS, and also the vice chair of the Multi-Stakeholder Initiatives at the EPRM. She's going to talk to us today about the role of the different players along the supply chain, talking about upstream and downstream companies, the role the EU herself will play, and as well as the producer companies, regional blocs, and CSOs in this implementation process of the regulation. She would address the risk management, due diligence, technical support, the capacity we need, and also the access to finance. She will look at the regional certification schemes available and also how producer countries must govern. Madame Leute, please, the mic is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for having me again a second time on this very interesting conference. And thank you to Nancy for summarizing. I think, yeah, you mentioned a lot of the points that indeed were mentioned last time, and I also wanted to repeat, so I won't do that. Yeah, I cannot share, or my presentation won't be shared here, or it will be shared in the chat. So you won't see it. You have to open and download it yourself. So I saw it was already shared in the chat. So I think it will be helpful if you open that, and then yeah, everyone can see the presentation for itself. And then I will say every time I go basically to the next slide, and then you can run through the presentation with me. Yeah, last time during the first conference, I gave a brief introduction of what the EU regulation is, the obligations that there are for importing companies in the EU, and how this is relevant for Africa, because as Frank said, it's yeah, it's of course an EU, so European Union regulation, but it will affect Africa one way or another. It's difficult to predict. Obviously, the aim of the EU regulation is to have a positive impact on producing countries, so also on Africa. However, yeah, I also definitely see there are risks that it will have a negative impact, or there could also be the possibility that it won't have an impact at all, and then that would also mean that it's not a successful implementation of the regulation, because like I said, the main objective of the regulation is to have a positive effect and break the link between natural resource exploitation and the continuation of conflict. Yeah, I'm going to slide 2 of the presentation. I will just briefly introduce myself for those who weren't there last time. So I'm Lotte Hoeks. I work for a research institute based in Belgium. And we do research on issues of natural resource. Sorry? Maybe that was not to me, I think. Do you hear me fine?
Yes, we do.
We hear you.
Please continue.
Someone who was not muted.
Okay, good. Then I'll just continue. So yeah, a research institute based in Belgium, focusing on natural resources and conflict mapping. And we mainly work in Central Africa, and I myself mainly work in on the EU level, so the European Union level. Also, like has been said already, I'm also the vice chair of the European Partnership for Responsible Minerals. This is a multi-stakeholder initiative consisting of industry actors, government actors. The ICJLR is also a member, and NGOs. I will move to slide 3, but I think I can go very quickly. I wanted to give a small recap of yeah, the main points of the regulation, basically to have us all on the same page. But Nancy yeah, mentioned basically everything. So this can be quick. In 2017, the EU created the new regulation on conflict minerals, and the regulation has entered into force this year, the 1st of January. And the regulation lays down due diligence obligations for importers of the 3TG minerals, tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold. I'm moving to slide 4. Like I already said, the aim of the regulation is to break the link between conflict and natural resource exploitation, mineral trade. And the regulation does this by imposing obligations for importers importing 3TG from conflict affected and high risk areas. I think it's important to stress here that this is quite different than the Dodd-Frank Act. Some of you might be familiar with the US Dodd-Frank Act. It has a lot of similarities, namely the objective, I would say, is the same, to break the link between conflicts and mineral trade. However, the Dodd-Frank Act was only focusing on the DRC and its neighboring countries, and the EU regulation has a global scope. So it includes all conflict affected and high risk areas. I will go more into depth later on that concept. First, I will touch briefly upon what it means, due diligence. Also, I will be very brief here because I did this last time. So the EU regulation follows the OECD due diligence guidance. It makes it mandatory. This, I think, is a very positive strategy of the EU, because the OECD due diligence guidance is already widely accepted and also widely adopted by very different actors, such as the LBMA, but also governments like the DRC. So instead of creating a new scheme or new regulatory framework, they adopted the OECD due diligence guidance. So that is something that most actors, already industry, but also government actors, are already familiar with. Just to run you very quickly through the OECD due diligence guidance, there are 5 steps. The first step is to establish strong management systems. The second step is to identify and assess risks in the supply chain. The third step is to design and implement a strategy to respond to the identified risks. The fourth step is to carry out an independent third-party audit of supply chain due diligence. And then the final step is to report annually on all these due diligence steps. I'm moving to slide 6, and like I said, I will go a bit more into depth in the concept of conflict affected and high risk areas, because I think it's important, to have a clear understanding of that, because it obviously also tells you more about how producing countries, African producing countries, could be affected. So first of all, what is a conflict affected area? It is a country or an area that is characterized by the presence of armed conflict, widespread violence, or other risks of harm to people. And high risk areas are areas with, for example, political instability, insecurity, widespread violence, or widespread human rights violations. And what kind of risks are then included to be happening in these countries? That is serious human rights abuses, and also providing direct or indirect support to non-state armed groups or to public or private security forces. So that is the definition. That is the definition, again, of the OECD due diligence guidance that the EU has adopted. However, what the EU has done differently, I'm moving to slide 7 now, is that the EU has come up with a list of countries. So the OECD has basically, developed this definition and left it there. The EU decided to publish a list with countries to help companies. However, in my opinion, you could ask to what extent it helps companies, because the EU is also very clear that this list is indicative and not exhaustive. So it doesn't mean that if as a company you source from a country that is not on the list, that you're not obliged to do your due diligence. You're still obliged to do your due diligence, because it's possible that the risks that I just mentioned also happen in other countries. So it can also give some confusion, because it's not, it doesn't mean that you just look at the list and if you source from another country, you're fine, you have no obligations. So in that sense, you could question how much support it is. Then I'll move to the next slide, number 8, which gives an overview of the countries that are on the list. It's very important to note that in most cases, it's not the entire territory of the country that is on the list, but only certain areas. So certain provinces, or even more specific. So what I will do after I finish my presentation is that I will share the website. It has a special website with the list, and then you can click on the country you want to know more about, and then it gives a very specific, detailed description of which area is included or not. So as you can see on the map, a lot of African countries are included, but also certain countries in Asia and in South America. And then I move on to slide 9. And one of the risks that also comes with publishing such a list is that that industry actors might disengage from these countries. So there's definitely a risk of stigmatization, and that companies, instead of risk mitigation, so continue to sourcing from these areas, doing their risk mitigation, doing their due diligence, that they instead disengage from these countries and say, oh, I don't want to bother, it's too complex, and basically be risk avoidance. So avoid any risks and just go to a country that they know there won't be any questions asked by anyone. And some of you might be familiar that this is also what happened at the time with the Dodd-Frank Act. So that's the American legislation. And I think the risk there was even more, I would say more risky, because it was only targeting one country. So in that sense, companies still had a lot of choice to go elsewhere and to disengage from specifically the DRC and its neighboring countries. Well, in this case, obviously, it's different, because as you can see, or from the previous slide, there are really a lot of countries mentioned on the list. So it's not easy to say, I will just disengage from all the conflict affected areas. But that being said, it's still definitely a risk, and a risk that should be, that should be tackled as well. So slide 10, I'll mention some possible responses to avoid this disengagement. One of the first, I think, is that producing countries, and then especially the ones that are mentioned on the list of conflict affected and high risk areas, are well aware and prepared for the due diligence requirements that this regulation imposes on the companies sourcing from their mines. And this indeed is something that I also mentioned last time, that in my view, there's still a lot of work that remains to be done to inform producing countries of what this means for them. So this new regulation is coming up. Most producing countries, governments are familiar with the OECD guidelines, but still, what does it concretely mean for them? What does it mean for the miners? So I think a lot of work remains to be done to prepare producing countries for what is coming, or what's already here, actually. Then effective measures at both ASMs, or artisanal small-scale mining, and large-scale mining operations should be put in place to avoid human rights abuses and conflict financing. And very much related to that is transparency and accessibility of data, to assure that potential buyers are aware of the absence of red flags on the ground. And that is something, that the research institute I work for is very much specialized in. So we also, as a response to the Dodd-Frank Act, we have done a lot of research in the DRC, mapping more than 3,000 mining sites, and giving information in a map, but you can click on each of the separate mining sites and giving very detailed information of the situation on the ground. And this can help companies to know that there are a lot of mining sites where there are no issues at all, because what you often see is that that's what happened in the DRC, that companies, like I said, disengage, so avoid the risks. And if an area or a province is on this CARA list, that they would say like, "Oh, I won't touch it." Probably all the mines in that province are, let's say, red flag. Well, actually, that is obviously, as most of you will know, not the case at all. That this is much more nuanced, and that an armed group might be present, or that human rights issues might have been reported on one mining site, doesn't mean that the entire area is affected, not at all. So to have this data transparency for companies is very important, so that they are assured basically that it's fine and there's no problems to source from these mining sites. Then finally, and this is also a point that Frank obviously raised in his introduction, is that it could definitely help, and I think it would be very powerful if Africa creates its own OECD-aligned mechanism for the management of conflict minerals and responsible sourcing. This could include, for example, mineral certification mechanisms like the ICGLR has, and as one of the recommendations of the last conference, it could also include the establishment of an African Precious Metal and Minerals Association. Then I'll move to slide 11. So this is also something I mentioned last time, and this time I'll focus more on the possible consequences, risks, and responses for producing countries. So companies who source, so European importers who source below a certain threshold, are not obliged to do their due diligence under the EU regulation. This was meant to not set a bar too high for SMEs, so for small and medium-sized companies, that the burden on doing their due diligence would be too high for them. All volume thresholds set by the EU are set at a level to ensure that no less than 95% of the total volumes imported in the EU are covered. So to give you an example, for gold, for refined gold, this is 100 kilograms, and for gold ores, so for unrefined gold, this is 4 million kilograms. However, moving to slide 12 now, the thresholds do not guarantee that only the lower risks import will be exempted from the requirements of the regulation. Actually, much more on the contrary, there are good reasons to suspect that many of the highest risk imports into the EU are transacted in relatively low quantities. and some of which may definitely fall below the thresholds and therefore will fall outside the scope of the EU. Now, how is this relevant for you or for your country? I'm moving to slide 13 now. The problem is that the EU has not disclosed a data set with the imported volumes and their origin, disaggregated by individual importer. So this means, first of all, this was a question from last conference. This means, first of all, that no one knows which importer will fall under the regulation or not. Obviously, you can say from some big companies, they will for sure fall under it because you know they're so big. But for the majority, we don't know because the EU has not published which companies will be affected. Secondly, and that is the point I want to stress now, is that at this stage, because the EU doesn't give this transparency, it is difficult to anticipate whether direct EU imports from a specific country will be affected by the EU regulation. So for example, based on their value, several countries on the CARA list in Africa would likely fall below the threshold. So if you only look at what this African country is exporting to the EU, if you look at that number, we know for sure that it will fall below the threshold. However, since we do not know the companies, we cannot say, so if a company is only, let's say Sudan, just to make it less abstract. So Sudan, if we look at how much they're exporting to the EU, we can say it falls below the threshold. However, if it's a company that imports from Sudan, also importing from Mali, from Colombia, from Canada, then it has to do its due diligence reporting, meaning that Sudan will also be affected. So since we do not have this data, we cannot say whether a specific country will be affected, yes or no. Is this important? Well, you can argue yes or no, because on the one hand, you can argue, will this regulation have an impact at all? But I think it is important to know as a country, as a ministry, mining ministry of a country, to know whether you have to prepare your mining sector for the new regulation, for the new requirements, or not. And I think it makes sense to do it anyway, because there are the OECD requirements and more questions are being raised anyway from different fronts. So I think also if a country does not fall within or is not impacted by the EU regulation, it will still be impacted one way or another sooner or later by the OECD due diligence guidance. But still, this lack of transparency and this lack of knowledge basically, gives some uncertainty and is I think not fair for countries to know, do I fall under the regulation, yes or no? Now I'm moving to slide 14, to the ASM sector. This was also mentioned by Nancy. There's a potential risk that the regulation may encourage companies in Europe sourcing from ASM to withdraw from the artisanal small-scale mining sector, and because it's much harder for the ASM sector to comply with the due diligence standards. So there's a risk that companies will favor large-scale miners in producing countries as they have better capacity and financial means to comply with the new requirements. Moreover, without structural support, there's a risk that knowledge and means to ensure transparent production chains at the upstream level remain limited. And very much related to this is an important point that there's an uneven distribution often along the supply chain. So this is also something we have seen in the DRC, a country that has a lot of experience with regulatory measures, that ASM miners pay the cost. And then you can wonder, what incentive is there for an ASM miner to be part of such an initiative if it just becomes more expensive, if they can sell their gold better to a trader that doesn't demand anything of it, if they earn more, what incentive is there to adapt new and more expensive requirements? So yeah, without this external support to the ASM sector, miners may increasingly depend on a reduced number of purchasers, which in the end obviously can very much negatively impact their position in the market, because like I said, it's also, I think it's fair to think that more and more requirements will come along the OECD guidelines. So it might also be good for miners to adapt to these new regulations. However, again, they need support in this, and costs need to be distributed evenly. I want to stress here that the EU has also learned from the Dodd-Frank Act here that the ASM sector really suffered, especially in the first years of the Dodd-Frank Act. So the EU has come up with an accompanying measures fund. It's a pot of money to fund projects in producing countries that specifically assist the ASM sector. This is obviously very positive. However, it remains quite ad hoc, is my personal opinion, because it are projects here and there, and it's not really a structural reform or structural help in the ASM sector. So yeah, it's a project and it can be in a country, but then obviously it will just impact a handful of mines or maybe more, but still these are not structural improvements to the sector. I move to slide 15. Yeah, so what am I talking about when I say structural improvements? I think one of the main responses to avoid these risks is to formalize the ASM sector. For instance, this could be done by reducing the bureaucratic burdens for miners to access property rights, help and assist governments to reform taxes, basically to harmonize taxes to within the region to stop incentivizing smuggling and to lower the cost of miners registration, and also to work with producer countries to adopt responsible sourcing standards, such as, for example, the craft code. I'm not sure if you're aware with it. I can share that in the chat as well, which is a standard, a very approachable standard. Let's say it doesn't have a very high standards. Let's say it's really adapted to the reality on the ground to improve artisanal and small-scale mining conditions. I'm moving to slide 16. So my last 3 slides, I will mention some of the recommendations to producing countries, to civil society, and to the private sector that were made during our conference in January. Some of you might have been there as well. It was a conference organized by BMZ, the German government, and RMI. The theme of the conference was the EU regulation seen from a producer country perspective. So it was, the aim was to bring in the perspective of the producing countries, lessons learned from Dodd-Frank, and also recommendations for successful implementation. These recommendations that I mentioned here on the slide were made by CSOs, EU policymakers, and participants from producing countries. especially the ICGLR was very well represented. For the producing countries, the main recommendations were to, first of all, formalize the ASM sector. I mentioned that before. To reduce the bureaucratic and protective regulations on land ownership for ASM, to ensure alignment between domestic and international regulations, and yeah, this to reduce confusion basically and increase effectiveness. So I think that is also something to take into account for a possible new African measure here. And I think again, like yeah, following the OECD, the widely accepted standard would be a good idea. And then use the EU conflict minerals regulation as an opportunity to mainstream human rights and gender into the national or regional regulations. The harmonization of taxes I already mentioned, and to adapt appropriate measures to incentivize due diligence, specifically in the domestic gold supply chain. Then I move on to recommendations to the private sector, again, that were made during this conference. So one was to expand the scope of efforts to include other relevant issues, for example, child labor, environmental standards. Secondly, the point I already made about cost transparency of due diligence efforts to encourage the sharing of financial burdens along the entire supply chain, so not just by the upstream and by the ASM miners. Another recommendation to companies was to improve their risk management and to stop sourcing from smelters and refiners that fail a third-party audit. Specifically to downstream companies, so the ones importing in the EU, was to engage with the upstream to provide capacity building support and technical support for progressive improvement among producers. And finally, to facilitate access to finance. Yeah, for example, in the DRC, there's really a dependency from ASM miners on pre-financing from traders, which brings them in a dependency position. And this also brings them in a position where they are not free to choose with whom to trade, etc. So to free them from this dependent position, it would be good if it would be easier to access finance. So for example, getting a loan from a bank or from a company who pre-finances. Then finally, for civil society, I'm at slide 18 now. Yeah, this is both for civil society organizations in producing countries, so in African countries or other continents, and also at the EU level to advocate for certain issues at the EU level. A first recommendation was to go beyond conflict, so also include socioeconomic, environment, health and safety issues in the work. To scale monitoring and evaluation of the EU regulation, specifically for CSOs in African producing countries. This would be what is the effect, the impact of the EU regulation on the ground? Is it negative? If yes, this should be flagged the earliest possible. Also, obviously, to raise awareness on the EU regulation and its obligations. Enabling of knowledge sharing. I've mentioned the DRC already a few times, but there's quite some experience in the Great Lakes region on this issue of responsible sourcing, not just the Dodd-Frank Act, but also because of the numerous tracing and certification mechanisms that exist. So there's definitely a lot to learn from the Great Lakes region. So knowledge sharing between countries would be very helpful, I think. Strengthen local forums for the sustainable development in ASM communities. Encourage CSOs to play an active role in due diligence. For example, like I mentioned, the reporting of incidents or the reporting of the absence of any red flags. And finally, to keep up the pressure. That's always a recommendation to CSOs. Then slide 19, there were some recommendations for collective action. The first one was to speak about responsible sourcing instead of conflict minerals. There was made the recommendation was made to change the name of the legislation, the EU legislation, in the regulation for responsible minerals instead of the regulation of conflict minerals, which in my view makes a lot of sense because conflict minerals is quite a narrow understanding of the issue. First of all, because it also includes human rights issues. It's not just the link to conflict. But secondly, because it has a very negative connotation. Responsible sourcing obviously is a much more positive term of how we want to see it instead of what you want to avoid. Secondly, to get rid of silos, so cooperate and cooperate among organizations. So that means multi-stakeholder industry, cooperate with CSOs, with governments, etc. This is an effort that needs to be done in cooperation. For example, in a multi-stakeholder initiative like the EPRM. Then identify and protect vulnerable groups in the supply chain and develop tools to support the enforcement of the EU conflict minerals or responsible sourcing regulation and capacity building to strengthen enforcement in producer countries, again, by multi-stakeholder initiative, civil society, private sector, etc. And then a general recommendation was as well to look beyond Central Africa, beyond the Great Lakes region. Generally, like I said now a few times, there's a lot of experience in the Great Lakes region, which I think other countries can learn a lot of, but it's also important to get the interest from other countries. So for example, West Africa is also impacted by this regulation, and that they also are aware of the OECD due diligence guidance, for example, because in Congo and the neighboring countries, there's quite an awareness, but we need to look beyond. This will impact, a lot of, like you've seen the list, a lot of African countries and a lot of other countries in Asia and South America, and it's good to include them as well in these discussions. So that was my presentation. Please let me know. I think we'll do that later if you have any questions.
Thank you very much, Loïc, for that extra dose of our understanding. I forgot to mention that you have privileged information on the genesis of this regulation, and thank you for espousing it excellently. If I take anything home or anything away at all, it will be your a call that Africa needs to develop or create her own OECD aligned mechanism for responsible sourcing. So that was something I'll take away. Very, very impactful commentary. You also tried to explain to us the difference between Dodd-Frank's Act and the EU law, and also the similarity between them. And one is in terms of the scope and also the ideology, and that brought much understanding. There was a question I had on the name, and I think you addressed it on the slide 19. I had this question, and I'm picking, and I picked it also from the chat room. Sipenzwe was asking the similar question about calling it conflict minerals, but that slide 19 answered that question for us. So I would like to thank you very much, and we'll continue question time. Maybe you add more. We'll move straight away without much ado to Mr. Joseph Okedi. Mr. Joseph Okedi is the Assistant Commissioner at the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Development at the Directorate of Geological Surveys in Uganda. He's going to tell us about the term we've been hearing, or the acronym ICGLR, for the past few months, and also explain the regional effort to curb illicit exploitation of minerals in Africa. Mr. Joseph Okedi, the audience have been waiting patiently for you. Audience, please meet Mr. Joseph Okedi. The mic is yours, sir.
Thank you, moderator. My name, I go by Engineer Joseph Okedi. I'm the Assistant Commissioner in charge of inspections and monitoring at the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Development in Uganda. I also sit at the Regional Committee of RI, that's the ICGLR Regional Committee. I am very happy and I appreciate all the knowledge I've learned from the previous presenters, because knowledge is something that you can never fully say that you have gotten all of it. For example, the differences of the OECD and the Dodd-Frank 1502 Act. Most of the things I wanted to discuss apparently have been covered, but what I've been requested specifically to talk about is the efforts within the region to really curb illicit trade in especially the 3 TGs. I did prepare a short presentation because I knew we shall have maybe a discussion forum, but I've also shared a paper in brief. I think it will be shared later. So I'm just going to capture a few points in accordance with the agenda that was presented to me, which specifically wanted to talk about the 6 tools of the RCM, 6 tools of the RINR, which are helping the ICGLR implement this strategy. I wouldn't want to indulge on the background of a lot of how ICGLR formed this kind of committee, because I know that's a preamble which you know, so that we give room for discussions later, which I think will give us all a proactive way of approaching this matter. But just as a background, I don't know if my presentation was shared, but on slide 4, because I don't want to do the rest of the introduction, I want to just capture the bullet 1, which primarily talks about the establishment of a chain of custody for the 4 minerals, currently 3, but efforts are being made to bring in gold comprehensively, and also to bring to light the fact that in respect of the 5th protocol, which was the fight against illicit trade, there was constituted a steering committee for which I'm a member. There are members from all the countries under the ICGLR, and that committee was approved by all governments. So in line with today's topic, governments are committed and strategically developing mechanisms to implement actions and strategies in respect of fulfilling the curbing of either illicit trade and also the reduction of aiding of conflict in the region by trading such commodities. But the principal approach that is in place, I'm talking about slide 4 in governance of RINR, is to establish a certification system for those 3 TG. So these supply chains for the 3 TG under the certification mechanisms are to be audited within the framework and the guidelines given by ICGLR and the national or member states are already being facilitated or guided by development partners and also the Secretariat to develop their own domesticated manuals and so forth and so forth. But if I quickly just go through, if I quickly just go through the 6 tools which you all know, since that was my topic. The 6 tools of RINR constitute the core tool, regional certification mechanism. The OECD in all its objectives and the Dodd-Frank Act in all its objectives and aims are targeting traceability of commodities, and that's why the key tool we have is RCM, which I'm going to elaborate further in a short while. But also what is failing us, for example, the impact of this EU regulation, a regulation that has come in place. Later on, I will wonder if the EU consulted national legislations as we are expected to harmonize national legislations, domesticate protocols and initiatives, but there is a gap. I wonder whether when such legislation comes from the EU, OECD, the US, whether they have ever bothered to consult national or member states of the ICJLR or the affected member states. That is a point we shall discuss later. We shall give recommendations and suggestions to that effect. Because even if we write to them, we are writing because we are impacted by such laws, and so we are doctoring our situation to suit the other situation, and we are the producers, mostly originators of all issues. That is a key thing which is not in the presentation, but we should put it in place for discussion. The other tool is, of course, because we need to know how production and the supply chains are moving. So there's a regional database on mineral flows, and the documentation is being done by all countries. As you know, Burundi, Tanzania, the Congo, Rwanda, they already have systems in place. Uganda has a functional system in place, except that the legislation is due to be gazetted, I think maybe by end of this quarter or something like that. The issue of artisanals, the precurrent speaker, I thank her for mentioning a lot of interventions that we anticipate in the artisanal mining sector, which is difficult and forms almost over 90% of the activities governing these four commodities within the region. So those interventions also under the ICJLR, there have been very many consultancies that have been procured, put in place. However, the implementation mechanisms are supposed to be supported by the states, and those implementation mechanisms are taking a little bit of time because to understand the sector needs financing, needs sensitization, needs training, needs adequate legislation, and so forth and so forth, which you know. The fifth tool, which has been very difficult for people to implement, I'm happy Uganda has recently, this is just a summary, Uganda has recently, through the cabinet, endorsed the entry into the EITI initiative. That was, I think, in January or February this year. So we expect to advance and modify our legislation to that effect. The sixth tool is whistleblowing. So I'm going today to concentrate quickly on the guiding principles of what we call the regional certification mechanism, because it constitutes one of the core tools. The far and most importantly is transparency, especially on mineral flows, which should be made public, which I think according to the OECD regulations is one of the primary objectives. especially when you look at the minor trade chain or chain of custody. And burden of proof falls, according to the excerpts I've read from the regulation, falls on the exporters or importers, but also now we are responsible mostly as producers. I'm looking at slide 7. Then there should be also these mandatory third-party audits, which also, according to the EU new regulation, it should be able to be giving us satisfaction and trade comfortably. Now, there is a challenge within implementing nations. I mentioned it earlier. How do we adapt our current systems as much as possible to legislation which may be foreign without reinventing the wheel of what we already think are credible systems? That is a very key challenge that will be taken up later on. But we think we shall design mechanisms to adapt and over time incorporate all the relevant and the best practices. I want to jump to relevant slides. That RCM, in the 6 tools, the RCM, the core tool, has 4 critical elements that need to be taken into account because they have limited with the 6 tools. So one of the key elements, chain of custody tracking, that from source mine side to export, from source to the market. That one, I think member countries are doing it effectively, and especially when you look at even the African Mining Vision and other initiatives where we encourage domestic value addition, this will be effectively implemented over time, which Uganda, I'll speak mostly for examples, I'll speak using Uganda as a case study. The second one, the regional tracking of mineral flows, using the ICGLR database because it is a centralized database, which we are periodically expected to feed into. The third-party audits by people who have already been endorsed by the ICGL Executive Secretariat, and of course also member countries. That one is also one of the key elements. And then there's an independent person to bring integrity to the whole system, the one they call an independent mineral chain auditor. But however, all this is done under what has already been standardized using the ICGLR manual. This is South Standards and Procedures, and works, it has been developed in line with OECD guidelines. So I think the ICGLR and the region's efforts are compliant so far, and any updates are always bilaterally, tripartitely discussed. The other elements which are very key may not be very relevant for me to discuss right now because they are kind of poor. But just to bring out another key point, in slide 10, the roles of government during the chain of custody. For governments within the region, our experience is that we are obligated to trace national production, minerals imported or exported, and minerals imported for re-export, because we are looking at cross-border mineral trade where there's a lot of smuggling and all other illicit activities. That's where chain of custody loses its integrity. So with that, we keep reviewing the chain of custody of documents before export, and we put mechanisms to track within the region member states where all these commodities are coming from, getting reprocessed, and either on transit or otherwise, and they move. But we are also open to outsourcing. My responsibility is inspection and so on. But we are also open to outsourcing. We are also open to outsourcing these activities to different organizations, especially the chain of custody service providers. So quickly, without indulging in the Ugandan system, I want to jump to the fact that apart from countries failing to domesticate legislation, Uganda has done it, and other countries are trying to do the same. However, there is what we call the financing of the certification mechanism itself in the member states. It's something that has been studied within the region. There are different factors at play because the sector is largely informal, and therefore we need to look at development partners focusing on key and core elements like of ASM and getting countries to focus their budget also in encouraging activities. With that, with that, I know there are currently many countries, but effectively, if we're looking at the region, we only have about 5 countries which are really compliant. So when you put in place legislation, for example, the EU regulations, we have to focus on encouraging countries to develop and incorporate in their policies and legislation the efforts that regulation of the EU is seeking to address. It's very, very pertinent. It is one of the factors that are derailing the progress in the implementation of transparency initiatives in the 3TG mineral sector. But speaking of Uganda, we've a policy which is encompassing all that. We have a mining and minerals bill, which is already in the final stages. We have regulations which are waiting to be gazetted, they are draft. And the rest of the activities, we have established a unit and everything ready to go. But you know, legislation and domestication is the key aspect of all that. Now, strategies that we are trying to use in Uganda and the region also at large is to accept some private, that is in slide 23, I'm just jumping there, because we need these strategies, because they talk about the EU regulation when we discussed it last time nationally. We need to accept some private traceability schemes, because we have had a problem where these traceability schemes are imposed on member states. For example, it's ITRI, in most cases, somehow being dominant in the industry, gets imposed on sector players, the traders, the exporters, the producers, and so on. And yet we have these other guiding principles of the RCM, which are in line with the Dodd-Frank Act, the EU regulations, and so on. So we need to find out how to deal with that, and we need to delink these service providers from the auditing system of ICGLR. Those are strategies we're thinking, and they have been adopted also, I think, by the committee or being considered. However, there are high costs involved in implementation and audit, and whether you put the regulation in effect or not, there are some high costs for the producer, the exporter, even government, but government can deal with it in its own way in implementing this traceability scheme. So once this rule is, the regulations are effective as they are, please let's consider how we are going to finance member countries until they can sustain themselves in implementing these requirements of the EU regulations. And also, apart from access, we need to increase ownership as member states, because we seem to be acting in remote. Are we compliant with EU regulations because they are the buyers? Or what do we own? Member states should take ownership of that fight, and we should not be seeing it as an external. And of course, we need to strengthen partnerships among all stakeholders. And I'm very happy this is one of the conferences trying to achieve that. And with that, we think eventually we shall be moving forward. Now, donor funding, if necessary, is welcome, but mostly the strategies for member states to fund would be the best option. I shared with you a different, this was just a small brief PowerPoint, but a different PDF paper that I hope will be shared by the organizers. At the moment, apart from any other questions that I'll be sending to from time to time during our discussions, let me stop at that for the 6 tools. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Joseph Okedi. That was very insightful. And I am happy to hear that government is committed to establishing a certification mechanism for 3GTs under the IGLR. Thank you. But what I also picked was that with all these regulations and laws coming into force onto Africa, the cardinal reason is for traceability. So you also encourage us to have our own traceability schemes so that we'll not have these laws imposed on us. And that is very, very encouraging and forward thinking. But if you, as high as you are up in the industry, from where you sit and from what you do, you also query, just like Professor Nelly Mutemeri of South Africa, that you wonder whether the new EU law or the proponents did any consultation with stakeholders in Africa. And then that worries me because it's becoming a question that everybody is asking. It appears that there hadn't been enough consultation for those who are actually supposed to be affected or benefit from it. Perhaps they did, perhaps they did not, perhaps it's something yet to be done. But thank you for all that. And from now onwards, I want to refer to the EU new law as the EU law on responsible sourcing. Without wasting your time, there are questions on the chat room for you. One person asked whether you can help force through the traceability law in Parliament. And that's coming from Sentiba Gordon. We will talk about those questions later, but let's quickly move. I think we are running against time. Let's quickly move to thinking forward. And the next person will be Samuel Agbo-Tabi. Samuel Agbo-Tabi is the president of the Central Africa Mining Association. He's also a board member at MADI. He's going to help us to think further about the possible solutions regarding the challenges that this new EU law will bring, especially for local miners. Mr. Agbo-Tabi, the mic is now yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator, for giving me the floor. And thank you, MADI, for putting together this e-conference on a very relevant topic and for allowing me to contribute to the conversation. In the interest of time, I'm going to focus on gold, which is the most affected 3TG, in my opinion, by this law, and on the ASM sector, which is probably most adversely affected, the most adversely affected segment of our industry. So as we know, most ASMs don't export their gold themselves. They usually have a middleman of some kind. And sometimes these are other ASMs who happen to have export licenses that group together the minerals or buy minerals from people around them and export it themselves, or even sell to other middlemen who are coming into the country. I want to start off by looking at, how are these ASMs selling their gold? And obviously there are two ways that they usually do it. There's the illicit way, which I'll give you a few examples. For example, in Central African Republic, gold is usually smuggled across the border into Cameroon and sold to some small scale or artisanal mining groups who also have an exportation license, or who are selling to larger middlemen who are coming into the country. And they declare that gold as coming out of their own production system. And that's possible because the difference in price between Cameroon and Central African Republic, especially when we look back at this as a federation years back, was somewhere around $5,000 in some cases, which is a huge difference. And obviously that's going to continue to incentivize people to go and buy gold there instead of buying it, in Cameroon. So buy and sell without having actually to do the work of mining. And this is also sometimes done with the complicity of certain government representatives that are in charge of policing the sector. Example number two, for example, gold is sometimes even smuggled out of our ports of entry, our legal ports of entry, not being declared, or you have those who are policing the ports also turning a blind eye, with money, et cetera, et cetera. And then they have other ways of exporting, just like the Libya line. And I call it the Libya line because, for example, last year, when flights were banned in and out of Cameroon because of COVID, that line was very active in buying and selling gold that came out of the artisanal small-scale mining groups. As gold prices were skyrocketing, that's how they found, that was the solution they found to shipping their gold out, which is obviously illicit, and these are just a few examples among many. And of course, you have the legal examples where people use commercial flights, private jets to come in and buy gold from ASM companies. And even in that case, you still have money that's sometimes given to government officials, people at the port, et cetera, to look the other way, or maybe allow them to declare a smaller amount of gold compared to what it is that they're shipping. So when you look at it, there are many ways. We have a system with many avenues of selling gold, both above and under the 100 kilogram EU regulation threshold. And it's very difficult for countries to really stop illicit flows of 3TGs. And I'll give you two parallels in a different industry. For example, Nigeria passed a law that banned the importation of rice. And my family is from a region of the country that actually borders Nigeria, and there is so much, rice that's illegally shipped through the main road that goes from Cameroon to Nigeria, because Nigerians love their jasmine rice, and the quality of rice that they find in their country, some of them find it inferior to what it is that they can import. And there's a lot of money to be made, so people do it. And in another case, in the same region, there was a ban on cocoa that was being exported to Nigeria. But Nigerians paid more for the cocoa than Cameroonians and other international organizations that would ship the cocoa out. And so it was very, very, they were not able to really stem the flow of illegal cocoa going out of the country into Nigeria. And if we're not able to stop, large trucks full of 50 to 100 kilogram bags of rice and cocoa, I mean, it's even harder to stop, 50 kilograms of gold, crossing a border. And I'll get back to that in a second, but who exactly pays for this new regulation, 3TG's regulation that which requires an increase in due diligence and procedures, and systems. And it's usually the person that has the least power and the least force, power in the system. And I saw that, last time we had this conference, Mr. Simpenzwe actually touched on that. Was the vice chair of the Rwandan Mining Association, had touched on it, that the person that bears the costs the costs are actually pushed upstream to the miners themselves. And also their lack of understanding of the new costs created by this regulation will further affect their ability to be able to negotiate the price for these products. Because, if someone comes to buy a large amount of gold and everyone that's coming is saying, hey, there are new laws, it's costing us more money. If the local miners don't understand what that cost is, they're always going to lose out. And so understanding is very important. This will push them into the black market, and they'll always sell their products to the person paying the most amount of money, regardless of policy in Europe. So some of the solutions that I thought of, and one of the things that you'll notice is a lot of these solutions are the same solutions that everybody's coming up with. Even though we're thinking about this in our own bubbles, in many cases we're coming up with a lot of those similar solutions. But some of the short-term solutions would be educating ASMs on the new regulation, and education is always part of any solution that you're going to have. But what I've noticed is a lot of times with the educating, they do not include, chambers of mines and other associations in order to be able to educate the smaller miners in the field. And I feel like not everybody gets the same amount of information. They might have something in the capital city or something in the regional city head office. And sometimes it just does not reach the person at the very bottom of the list. And an example that I'll even give is this program called AGOA, which allows many African countries, as well as other countries, to be able to import duty-free their products into the US. But I think a lot of the problem that people have is they don't understand the system enough to take advantage of that. And so you'll have a policy like that, which makes perfect sense, but you start to question, why are more people not using or taking advantage of that? And a lot of it is just, they're just not aware. They don't have enough information on the new system in place to take advantage. And so the true winners of policies like this new EU law are really those who are better at doing paperwork. And in most cases, you find that it's not our miners, it's not the ASM community. It's usually those people who come in and take advantage of the lack of information that this community has in order to be able to get a lower price for the product. Now, some of the long-term solutions are really regional value chains. Everything from regional smelters to gold jewelry making hubs, and education on how to make jewelry, et cetera, et cetera. If the buy price, the buy price would actually increase in the region, and it would make the illicit buyers have less control, in the market, and less incentive really to operate within that given market. So that's one of the things. And in order to really do that, I think it's very important that us as governments, as private sector, really push our governments to implement the AC, the African Free Trade Area, African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, because in the past, there have been countries who have signed these agreements, and at the end of the day, the implementation is not up to par. They sign the agreements, but it takes them so long to be able to implement it, and some never really do, even with some regional agreements that have been around for a very long time. There are countries that still have that battle trying to get some other countries to agree to the terms in those agreements. And another solution, a long-term solution, well, it could also be medium-term, but it would be to make international, mutually beneficial government-to-government agreements with other markets in Asia, for example, and really take charge of creating our own regulation. And I wanted to end really on that particular point, because this was something that was even talked about by Dr. Frank Mugeni, who had touched on the fact that, and this is a quote that I always put up: organize yourself or they will organize you for them. And this is something that I say all the time: organize yourself or they will organize you for them. And this statement is true in all things. African government and we in the private sector are here discussing reactionary strategies to the EU regulation that took effect this year. And this regulation wasn't done now, but we are now talking about it in a very reactionary way. We have been aware of the problems, of these same problems, just as long as the US and Europe has. We in Africa are even more affected than Europe by these conflicts being financed by certain minerals. It's our homes that are being burned, it's our businesses that are being destroyed. And I could say this personally as someone from Cameroon whose family is from the Southwest region, which is one of those conflict areas, which you can actually see on that list of conflict zones. Our minerals are being used for destruction and not for the building of our communities. And I believe it comes down to the fact that we are not allocating enough resources at a local and regional level to come up with strategies, with strategic plans to mitigate these risks and the resources to implement these in the field. And, in defense of governments, I do understand that we're still dealing with, potable water issues, lack of stable energy, malnutrition, bad roads, and many other issues that seem to take priority. But, through our governments and chambers of mines, we really need to tighten our belts and allocate the money necessary to lead the conversation on these issues that affect us directly, because it does affect us directly, and it should not be a conversation about what the EU is doing. The EU should be talking about what we have implemented here to be able to fix the problem. That said, I'm still glad that someone, in this case, the EU, is thinking about it and coming up with policies that are geared towards solving the problem. Sometimes it takes those kinds of actions to really wake us up, and it is within their right to decide to buy products that are more aligned with their beliefs. Now, whether or not the policies they put in place will work or not is still to be seen, but it's in their right to at least try. So I get that part. It's more effective, though, to get the buy-in when all actors are involved in the process of creating said policy. Otherwise, those it's imposed on do everything to try and circumvent it. And unless you have the keys to all the doors, many will succeed in circumventing the new laws. And others responsible for policing this within the countries will turn a blind eye. And that's all I have for you guys today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Samuel Agbo Tabi. Well, I understand everything you said, and I'm happy about especially the cost, understanding the cost-benefit analysis at the grassroots to allow some of these new regulations to work. And the example you gave about AGOA, also about the cross-border businesses along the borders of Nigeria and Cameroon, questions future. It means we have a lot of work to do. We'll not waste time. We'll go straight to the next speaker, and he is going to talk to us about the complying with the regulations. How does it affect the mineral suppliers or producers in Africa? So if we decide to comply with the regulations, what are the bottlenecks? What are the challenges? The person who is going to handle that is Mr. Richard Kofi Afenu. He is the former director of the Minerals Commission in Ghana, and also at the Ministry of Lands and Natural Resources here in Ghana. Without much ado, would hand over to Mr. Afenu. Mr. Afenu, the audience are waiting.
Hello.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and I'm really glad to be here and to share a few thoughts with you in relation to the subject matter that we have before us. Raymond has rightly said that, yes, indeed, I was at the Minerals Commission until July 1, last year. But then I had been on secondary to the Ministry of Lands and Natural Resources. And then I've spent quite about 3 years in the minerals and mining sector here in the country, Ghana, and have experiences in other jurisdictions as well. Now, clearly, we all know that this particular piece of legislation is to ensure the traceability of the three TGs. I mean, and it seeks to impose an omnibus legislation on the producers, so to speak. But because in the end, the producers will have to subject themselves to some form of due diligence in terms of how these minerals are produced and under what conditions and under what laws that they are produced. So one of the things that the legislation seeks to suggest is to look at whether the minerals so produced are from conflict-affected zones or what is termed high-risk countries. And clearly, it tends to bring about some level of ambiguity in terms of what is perceived as a high-risk country, where, for example, there are some weakness in existing governance and systematic violations of what international law, not of domestic law, but of what international law. So when such a thing happens, it lends itself to some level of ambiguity in terms of what may be perceived .
Hello, Mr. Afenu?
Some speculative classification of source of production of the 3 TGs. Hear me, please. Can you hear me, please?
Yeah, we lost you briefly, but we can hear you now.
So do I need to go back or it's fine? I can continue.
You continue.
I can continue. All right. Okay, thanks. And so clearly, like I did say, it could lead to some level of speculative, classification of the source of production of the three TGs in African countries. And the question is, who actually determines, these high-risk countries, and what level of risk would perceive as high? What are the criteria? I mean, even if they'll be based on the OECD or the US out, does it readily apply within in some jurisdictions, since jurisdictions in other countries vary from place to place. So we need to look at this and see how best they could be applicable, and to what extent those can be feasible. The EU or the European Commission was to publish a list of countries, but I'm not too sure to what extent that list is ready and then or has been published, and what are the criteria. So if, for example, the regulation that importers of mineral products into the EU has to establish and comply with what supply chain due diligence obligations, which are broadly imposed on the producing countries. And this can cover about four key elements, 4 key areas. Because to look at that, you have to look at the management system that is in place in the producing country. And it's not looking at only the production stage, but it's looking at the entire supply chain. And so maybe for the large scale mining companies, they could meet it to some extent. Even that, I think that they will have some level of challenges, because of the challenges that are associated with mining generally. But the question, therefore, how does it sit in with the ASM or the artisanal and small scale producers? That is where the big challenge is. And mind you, this is going to be done, this particular due diligence is going to be done by the importers. So these importers who are somewhere in the EU or maybe the EU community may not have a full understanding of the dynamics of the supply chain processes as far as ASM is produced in some African countries, or in many, if not all, African countries. And so would it be the case that they'll have a different set of due diligence standards for each supplier? A supplier in Ghana, and mind you, for example, Ghana produces about 40% of gold produced in Ghana comes from the small scale mining sector. And that's quite a significant portion of gold that is produced, given the fact that Ghana currently is the #1 gold producing country on the continent. And so that's a big chunk of production. And so therefore, and these are enterprises, SMEs, that will not have that kind of structure that would even exist, that may be properly documented for any EU importer to come and carry out a due diligence on. And so what do that do? It will encourage what? Illegal or what? Illicit exploitation of gold through middlemen who are ready and they are handy with their money to purchase such gold so produced. Now, to do the due diligence, you have to look at the risks. What kind of risk management system exists within the production line of that particular entity that is producing any of the 3 TGs? So in a typical, small scale or mining or artisanal process, though the operators may be conscious of the risks that are associated with their operations, these are poorly or not documented at all. And so if an audit is carried out, there may not be any risk management practices that will be properly documented that could be relied upon, though they may be unwritten practices. But how are they going to assess and value them? This is going to be a major challenge. So how do you look at that? And again, one of the pillars is that the Indian importers will have to carry out third-party audits. That will for their supply chain due diligence and risk management systems. So, I mean, who will be the appointing authority of this third-party audit? And what will be the criteria for carrying out this particular task? Will this same audit be applicable to a large-scale operation or a small-scale operator or an artisanal miner? These are things which are not clearly, outlined. And if you have a law or we have a legislation that is drafted without the total inclusion of the affected parties, this is what you would end up with. And I think that we need to go back to the basics and see that we go through the proper, processes and procedures to ensure that we get a legislation that is workable and enforceable. There is no point in having a legislation that you cannot enforce. I mean, that might as well not. We need to look at that. And for example, there's one other disclosure. So you don't supposed to or are expected under the law to report regularly on their policies and practices as far as the information that or what the suppliers go through, because the producers are in Africa. And the importer that is based in the EC, for example, will need to carry out what? Regular reporting and disclosure publicly. And what would be the implication of this? That would mean a public disclosure of the gross earnings of the suppliers of these minerals. So if you have a list of suppliers who are present, and then you are publicly disclosing their production. What it means is that invariably you are telling the whole world what their earnings are and what are the security implications. Has anybody thought of that? So there may might want to have themselves. There may not be the reality. So it is that we need to look at. Now, if you look at the regulation, it only prescribes that the importers of the 3Gs should consider. They should consider, look by looking at the volume of importers or the volumes that they import, whether they see a certain threshold. For example, I mean, they have to consider. So it is not any obligatory thing, and they are to review their existing supply chain contracts and suppliers and determine what other potential issues that may. I mean, this does not confer an obligatory responsibility on the importers. So it is a challenge in this area. So we need to look at all these things and see what we can make meaning out of this, legislation, which in my view at this point in time may not be the way to go at the point, to make sure that we are this. For example, the EU trade policy itself is very particular about sustainable development. That is, if these minerals that are produced are not produced in a sustainable manner, it is of concern to the EC. In one understanding, one could say that, well, it may be a way of trying to regulate the industry. But if you come up with a legislation that, in effect, cannot be enforceable or cannot be justiciable, for example, then, it is as good as not being passed into law as well. So, for example, if you look at the, responsible or the sustainable development trade policies, it talks about the social justice in their operations, respect for human rights and, high environmental standards. And these are all very important things. And as far as mining is concerned, it is very key to the production of any mineral commodity. And the EU trade policy really focuses how these specific issues relating to the environment, human rights, and labor rights, as well as responsible businesses, are actually carried out. So, for example, if you look at the environmental protection, the EU Trade Sustainable Policy talks about the Paris Agreement, the Kyoto Protocol on climate change, and all that. These are things which can be handled at a certain level by the large scale, small scale operators. Protocol on climate changes. Do they understand the commission, for example, they may have no clue at all to how some of these things are. So it could be a clear challenge. I'm very much aware that, for example, as part of the EU trade policy, natural resources have to be sourced from a legal source, for example, and that's why they signed a number of VPAs, that's partnership agreements, as well as the forest law enforcement governance, agreements. And some of this, and in Ghana, for example, you must have a license to be able to trade it for. But the question ask yourself is, to what extent is the EU itself able to enforce some of these agreements and the protocols? Do they just remain on paper, or they are enforced to the latter? If they are indeed, then we should be able to trace even every piece of wood forest product that leaves the shores of Ghana. But Raymond would agree with me that even in country, and the existence of the flag licenses, we still have species of rosewood, which is a banned product, being shipped out. So do these regulations remain on paper, or they are just things which are really enforceable? Of course, I mean, most jurisdictions have does not allow child labor and all that, which is very clear. And this has to be construed in the context of labor, a child who ought to have been in school and who has to carry out a mining activity, and which is a paid job, as opposed to an activity where a parent is involved in a particular small-scale activity or a particular artisanal activity, and his son or child follows him to carry out a day's activity when he's off school. Within our jurisdiction, that cannot be termed to be child labor. He will probably be assisting or supporting the father or the parents to carry or to make a living out of a business entity that the father does it mean that gold that is produced from that source cannot be traded into the EU? And I did say that if you aggregate all the gold production from Ghana, for example, it's quite a substantial production. So we need to look at all this in its entirety and see to what extent that these things can carry out. One of the key pillars of the EU trade policy on sustainable development talks about responsible business that needs to be carried out. Yes, the large-scale operators can do that and do that probably effectively. But when it comes to the ASM operators, to what extent do they carry out corporate social responsibility? Some of the artisanal operators are even trying to make a living, and you need to add an additional burden for them to do that. So clearly, I mean, you cannot say that because an entity does not carry out a responsible business by carrying out a corporate social responsibility in an area, whatever comes out of his produce cannot be marketed in the EC. So I think that in conclusion, I just want to highlight some of the things, since I only have 15 minutes to talk. So I just want to highlight some of these key areas for us to ponder over and then to think through them very carefully. And so in conclusion, I would like to say that, well, it is true that this particular regulation may bring some kind of formalization into the ASM sector, but practically it will be impossible to implement this particular piece of legislation in this current form. The fact is, some of the African countries do not even have mining policies or maybe robust legislations covering the mining sector. And then you are going to impose an additional, responsibility, which would create.
Mr. Samba Diallo.
Somebody's microphone is on. Yeah, somebody's microphone is on. All right. So, okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. And so, therefore, we are going to. Some of them don't have even the legislations on mining policies and even robust mining legislations. And so we are going to add an additional legislation which would end up compounding the problem. So I think that it is clear that the EU, for example, may not be the major, the market for the three TGs. So what it means, therefore, is that this imposition of additional, legislation will create, illicit market.
Well,
which is already a problem, to track clean source, and by virtue of the fact that there is jurisdiction that is deemed to have been compliant, that unclean source of of the 3G mineral can become a clean source. So that can be a challenge as well. So like I did say, for example, in 2007, the EU itself passed a law on REACH. REACH is just registration, authorization, and registration of chemicals, which was to ban the importation of minerals which are considered to contain hazardous elements. The question is, we don't know to what extent the EC had enforced that, because if they really had enforced it, then most minerals that are mined in Africa will have to be processed or maybe beneficiated to the level to remove any hazardous element. But I'm not too sure what has been done in that case. So I think that but the EU may not be a major consumer of any of the TTGs, and the rigidity of this imposition may result in the opening of other markets to these minerals. I think it's important that the EU reconsider its position, especially as the compliance of this regulation with country-specific or sub-regional protocols probably was not taken into account. I mean, there were no proper consultations to sit down to see how legislation could be drafted, to see that it would be something that can be enforced in the countries in which they have to be implemented. So with that, I think I bring my presentation to an end. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Richard, for bringing a lot of legal meaning and understanding to this discourse. And you've asked us to go back to the drawing board or to the basics and have a law or a regulation that is practical. And I side with you, and I have documented that. You also suggest that in such a law, there should be periodic disclosure, which would have other implications. But yeah, the discussion continues to move on. But if I take anything home at all, you appear to firmly say that this law may not be possible to implement in its current state. And so there may be a review. Thank you so much. We will now move to the final segment, which is actually a panel discussion between two friends or two business friends. They have over the years been championing for Africa. So though we have a few questions, and I can see Sipenzwe is saying we may have a cholesterol of regulations where in the future there may be another regulation from China, so that Africa needs to actually wake up and get her own regulation in place. With that in place, I'll call on Jeffrey Rhodes to take over the panel discussion. Under normal circumstances, we should have finished this program by now. But as you know, it's a new topic and a new theme and a baby theme. And so the opportunity is to just indulge and then extend it for the next 15 to 20 minutes and have a better understanding. So please bear with us. Jeffrey Rhodes, the mic is now yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that. Can you activate my camera, please, Mr. Administrator? Okay, good. Well, it's been really interesting. Congratulations on everyone's input. I've certainly really enjoyed it. It's fascinating. I'd like to throw something into the mix straight away. Okay, I'm British, so we're not European anymore. We're out the EU. Jerry is German. He's part of the EU, but we're friends anyway. I'll ask a kind of also, just thinking out loud, the laws largely used around the world for contracts, either business or otherwise, typically is based on the laws of England and Wales. And now we're looking at kind of focusing on the laws of the EU. And I don't quite get it, to be honest with you, why we should be doing that. I think it's much better if African laws that are suitable for Africa are developed and adopted. And if you like, the legal framework for that can be based on the UK. As I say, I haven't really seen any, for example, offtake contracts with producers, either large scale or artisanal, which are based on EU law. I haven't seen it, and you know, maybe we're going there, but I think one of the reasons that UK actually voted to Brexit was to take control of its own laws. So I definitely, my view is that we should be looking at appropriate laws for Africa, which are based more on UK laws of England and Wales than the EU. Jerry, what do you think?
Well, very good evening. Thoroughly enjoyable so far. But I would like to mention that something else just comes crop up all afternoon. The usage of these European laws with, I would say, to a certain extent, a very limited scope, but what concerns gold business in the European Union, which is mostly, the European gold industry is mostly driven by gold refineries. There are a few banks who do physical and derivative hedging, but most of the London OTC trading is, as we said, in the OTC market. My thought was during the whole time, would the EU condemn that they, according to these laws, that the European Union, the law would condemn business with, for example, possibly with criminals, felons, criminalized institutions, and so on. I have to admit, I don't think the European Union find this palatable. But nevertheless, the LBMA has convicted market launderers, money launderers, and HSBC and JP Morgan on their boards. I find this strange, but nevertheless, that's probably topic for another session. Yeah.
I think we can go there.
No, but I mean, I think it's still interesting that convicted felons, criminals, institutions are actually running the or are very, very high profile in this OTC market. The question what I have is, as rightly says, Lotte probably has an idea. If the EU found that some countries or artisanal mining, any group, is not in this respect fair for business, who is allowed to dish out punishment? Is this recommendation? Is this a slap on the finger? Is this a removal of trade license of livelihoods? And who makes this decision?
Look, I tell you, Jerry, it's really, as you say, Lotte. I thought Lotte's presentation was excellent. I mean, all the presentations have been good, but I thought Lotte was very kind of a lot of common sense in there.
Yeah.
But I just wonder. Look. I know this is about more than gold, but Jerry and myself, for all those listening, we're gold people. We know about silver, platinum, and palladium, but we're gold people.
All right, let's reduce it to gold in this case, Jeff, because otherwise we're getting again things. When I just hear Dodd-Frank, US, EU, all non-physical markets are absolutely putting the laws down which kind of gold used in physical markets and worldwide is acceptable or not. If China comes out with it relatively low, that might be a little bit of a different story, but China has not been known in the last 20 years for not using their unbelievable appetite for raw materials from Africa, not to their advantage. They're buying contracts left, right, and center. They're paying through infrastructure. They're paying with jobs and with generally raising the standards of the country they're working with. There's nothing wrong with it. Most of the European countries, they can't agree on hardly on anything. Yeah. So if you were an African country or an organization, AU, CUESO, you would do business with the people who actually put their money where their mouth is, and not just with talkers.
Yeah, that's a really good point you just made there, Jerry. Looking at we haven't got 2020 production from Africa available. I do have 2019, and it can't, 2020 with the pandemic can't be any bigger. So let's just use that 2019. So a total of 819 tons of gold were produced across Africa, both large scale and artisanal mining combined. Now, if we look at China,
what is that figure, Jeffrey?
819, let's call it 820. 820 tons, 819 tons to be precise, in 2019 was produced across the African continent. Okay, now in 2020, it's not going to be any more. It can't be with the pandemic. So just let's use the 819. Now, if we look at in China, China's gold imports 2019, I guess, exceed 1,000 tons. Jerry, more than 1,000 tons?
Probably around 1,000 tons.
Yeah.
Plus 450 tons on production.
Okay, but I'm talking, so imports of about 1,000 tons.
Yeah.
India, probably 800 tons. Let's call it 750 or 700. Between two countries, in India and China, imports of gold almost 2,000 tons. Now, those two countries alone can consume double, certainly, and 2.5 times, certainly double the amount of gold produced in Africa. And so I'm just asking, of what relevance is EU law for African gold producers when you've got the two major gold consuming countries in the world who need at least every ounce of gold that Africa produce? And I agree with your sentiment, Jerry. I think it's much more relevant to think about India and China and the laws there rather than the EU. And to be fair, China has been investing heavily across the African continent for the betterment. I'll bring this in. I don't know if the listeners and viewers are aware of something called an offsets program in the UAE. Now, that offsets program is actually to do with defense. And so, if you like, the UAE has a kind of structure where if countries want to supply the UAE with arms like fighters, jet fighters, armed equipment, those suppliers have to do something for the country, and it's called offsets. And so doing something for the country shows that they're doing, helping the UAE, and the UAE will then look favorably on those suppliers of arms. Now, I like that concept, this offset. So you do something to get something. Now, I believe across Africa, an offsets program would be great, so that people who are awarded mining contracts are seen to be doing something positive for Africa and the African gold mining sector. I think, Jerry, what do you think about that idea?
I mean, in principle, this is the same principle, but with one big difference. If somebody is already having mining licenses in Africa and using this, he will export most likely 90% of the time the gold outside, whereby all the weapons have come in. So they have a different level of responsibility towards a host nation.
Yes, look, it's good. Look, just for everyone that's, this is a nice kind of fireside chat between Jerry and myself, but we do see each other pretty much every day of the year. So I would urge people, if they've got any questions for both of us, just fire away, and the moderator can just sort of interrupt us. And yeah, I tell you something. A thought. Now's a thought. It's a bit off the wall, but soccer. I mean, look, Africans love soccer. I love soccer, but I'm a Spurs fan and Jerry's Arsenal, so we disagree on that. But now look, when you look at soccer in the UK, the big boys, the large-scale miners, are the Premier League. The English Premier League are the large-scale miners. Now, there are 4 other divisions in England. It's called the English Football League. Okay. Now, what happens? The big earners are the large-scale miners, the Premier League, and their revenue filters down to the artisanal miners. Naturally, this is the structure of football in England. Now, I would have thought it would be an excellent idea to have this large-scale mining, artisanal mining kind of cooperation where all the money is being made by the large-scale miners, and maybe some of that money should be filtered down into the artisanal sector, which would fit very nicely with Lottie's comments about, you know, formalizing the artisanal sector, because the problem with the artisanal sector is the informal, because it's just like the Wild West, and the people who are suffering the most are the artisanal miners themselves. So if you had this, sorry to use football kind of analogy, where the big guys are making a lot of money, that has to filter down into the artisanal sector. And one way of doing that comes back to something that whenever we're talking, we will mention time and time again. Africa needs a voice at the global precious metals table. It needs an African Precious Metals Association to bring everyone together and represent. And as I say, I think for me, to actually have money going from large-scale mining down to the artisanal sector in Africa would be a very positive step forward.
From my point of view, just say we have 22 countries in Africa with a flourishing gold industry. Then we have another 50 of, now probably 80 of base metal mining. Copper, lead, zinc, and so on and so on. Zambia, copper belt. Then you have cobalt. Then you have iridium. You have all these things which the world wants and needs. So there should be an African minerals with subsections, for example, on the gold industry. But this could lead, okay, one country has gold, the next one has copper, but it could lead to a harmonization of taxation levels.
Yeah, no, it's very good. I think that's a great idea. Does anyone have any comments that they would like to make, please?
Okay, thank you very much, Jeffrey and Gerard. These are very thought-provoking and forward-thinking contributions you two have brought on board. You are always doing that, and we are grateful. From where I stand, and I'll invite Mr. Chair to join you and also move the discussion through the Q&A session in a jiffy. But if I understand what we have here is that the EU law as it stands doesn't even have penalties, as they have put it across. Who is going to punish who when something goes wrong? And so that brings back Richard's statement that we need to go back and redraft the law. And of what relevance will the law be if the market is in China and India for every gold, for example, that is produced in Africa? So technically, the potency of the law is being brought into question here. But that's what the discussion is for, so that we digest it. And I would have to admit that the allegory you use, the football, to distill the understanding, went home straight. So thank you very much. The most important thing that I'm taking right now is the process or the procedure we can follow from mineral to mineral and have a harmonization taxation system for the whole continent. And I have been asking, why can't the EU benefit from every ounce of gold or mineral that is extracted from the soils of Africa? Well, thank you very much, and please stay on. And I would now invite the chairman of MADI, Dr. Mujeni, to join you in this discussion and move it through the question and answer session. There are a lot of questions on the chat, but Dr. Mujani, the mic is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. All the speakers, all the panelists, all the listeners, we still have the number of people that registered for this meeting are still glued on and listening to us. That is very important. Now, to put everything into perspective of what I want to say, my colleague who is a member of the MADI management team, Angela Mlenga, and I, in 2006, participated in a meeting in Vienna. It was called Sound of Africa, and it produced a Vienna Declaration. It was an NGO of NGOs, and it was in response to the EU-Africa strategy. Austria had the presidents of the EU. So like all they do, they start discussing what they can do for Africa, while Africa doesn't discuss what we should do for Europe. So we met almost 290 participants from 40 states. And at that time, I was still living in Britain. We were convened in Vienna, and we had a declaration, which I would send to the organizers of this meeting to discuss what came out of this meeting. And I want to quote a few things, then I'll tell you why. The representatives of the African and European NGOs agreed that they criticized the lack of genuine consultation with and participation by African partners in the drafting of the EU-Africa strategy and the unsubstantiated rhetoric, which claims that this is a joint strategy. Two, that they demanded that in the future formulation, implementation, and evaluation of the strategy, that there is genuine dialogue with African and European civil society, as well as African continent-wide, and regional organizations and states. Then the declaration called upon the European Union, its member states, the African Union, and the African governments to ensure delivery on existing agreements, such as Cotonou Agreement, those I don't want to refer to those ones, ensure that a rights-based approach to development is being followed. A rights-based approach to development, rights to education, rights to development, rights to no conflict, rights to live in a peaceful environment. This is a joint discussion that should appear between Africa and European. We agreed, we declared that we should keep the African people at the center of development. And these are part of what the declaration reads. But I'm bringing out this because EU and Africa has a joint strategy, which came out of that discussion all the way from 2006, 2007, but it culminated in the 2017 draft, which became now a real joint strategy between AU and EU, which informs the development partnership that we have between Africa and European countries. And it came into effect for implementation after Africa launched Agenda 2063, because the Agenda 2063 is a global strategy to optimize use of African resources for the benefits of Africa. While Africa has an Africa mining vision, which clearly stipulates the development of Africa, the EU has a raw materials initiative. It's in black and white. It's a blueprint for EU on what they want for their industries. And Africa has an Africa mining vision. So giving the statement, quoting the statement that Samuel said that if you don't organize themselves, they organize you for them, is literally what EU is putting laws that will regulate the access to raw materials for their industries. It's clear, it's simple as that. It's not putting in place regulations for the implementation of the Africa mining vision. And in 2014, I had a joint discussion we had at the African Union when I was still the head of Mineral Resources Unit with the EU delegation in Addis Ababa. We agreed to collaborate in terms of dialoguing on how the RMI can actually work with AMV to achieve a mutual benefit. But now here we have a law. And I heard from the representative, my brother Joseph Kedi from the ministry, and he narrated the 6 principles. And on the 6 principles, I heard of the enforcement of the EITI, which I don't dispute, because the enforcement of the EITI or adoption of the EITI at the national level in Africa is a sovereign issue. Yet the African member states at the highest level, at the summit level, decided that Africa should have its own African governance framework that will monitor the implementation of the Africa mining vision to ensure that it is in line with the objectives of the African initiative, African vision, Agenda 2063. So we have a blueprint of the African governance framework, but ICGLR is basing its own principles, and I'm not surprised, and this is a discussion, since this meeting is for discussing how to implement the recommendations. ICGLR is critical for the development of Africa, but the EU-AU joint strategy doesn't even recognize ICGLR because it's not among the 8 regional economic communities that are recognized by the African Union. Yet it is at the epicenter. It is adopting the EU rules and regulations. It is putting them into its own policies and certification schemes to govern the mineral resource development in Africa. And Africa also wants to use them for development. So here we are, where now I agree with my other discussants that, Jeffrey, why don't we have an African regulation? Why should we not have an African regulation for African development? And someone asks, China will come up with the regulation, and they probably have. On the sidelines before this meeting started, I discussed with Jeff, United Arab Emirates has come up with a draconian regulation. He was telling me each region is trying to look at how to develop their own sectors. This is not for Africa. It's for them. We are supposed to be adopting the laws into African mineral resources laws, policies, and regulations that are not for Africa. So if we want to achieve the Agenda 2063, if we are trying to achieve the African vision that we need to add value, you go to countries, we were in Burkina Faso trying to put a gold refinery, but there was no law, and one of our board members should be on this show, on this panel, on this listening in, Dr. Osman Ilbudo, who is a permanent secretary at the ministry. He will tell you what we went through to see that they could not actually we went up to the president, they could not put in a regulation, a refinery, because there was no regulation. And even some of the refineries in Africa are there, because they have gone through high level, and the high level says, we want add value, be there. But there is no regulation, there is no specific laws. Some countries have, some don't have, even at the sub-regional level. So when I hear from the ICGLR representative that they need to harmonize laws and policies within their members in the Great Lakes region, and yet this policy is for Africa, entire Africa. And Africa has not even inputted, we have not worked with ICGLR to adopt those principles within the framework of the Africa Mining Vision. Indeed, the ICGLR is not putting anything in framework or anything that is putting together within the framework of certification and so forth and regulating these minerals within the framework of Africa Mining Vision. They are putting it within the framework of the European Union, OECD guiding principles, which are non-African. So where do we go? How do we ensure that there is African rules and regulations that are actually adopted, but taking account of our market, because the market is quite important. And Jeff and Gerhard have actually, and I even listened to His Excellency President of Ghana giving a speech somewhere and saying, look, we have more market coming up in Asia. We may be focusing on Europe and America, but there are more markets coming up in Asia, which we need to focus on. And probably we could work better, South-South cooperation. How do we ensure that we can work on this and move forward? But above all, I will again take the mic to the moderator to take the framework forward. My conclusion here is, as we move forward, we put a partnership together. Let's look at both EU partners, Jeffrey and others, and Lotte who are here. Let's continue with the dialogue on how best we can put this together. You know, coming from the declaration that Sound of Africa declaration, I will share it with you, that it is an African People's Development Center, and we are looking at supporting the development efforts of Africans, because they don't want aid, they don't want, you know, this kind of help. They don't want just fish. They want to be taught how to fish and feed themselves, not to be fed. So let's not give them fish. Let them teach Africans on how to fish and then feed themselves, and then put rules and regulations that work for them. But they should be Africa-centered, wherever they come from, if we are going to adopt them within our own laws and our own regulations. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mujeni. I was hoping you would also take part in the question and answers period. I don't know if Jeffrey and Gerard have...
I would love to, Ray, if the time still allows. It's up to you with the, if you still give more time there, that's no problem.
All right, thank you. I don't know, Jeffrey and Gerard, if you have any other input, as well as Lotte. From what we are gathering at the moment, it appears that I have a few questions, but I wish the people themselves will come up and be given the chance to ask them in like 30 seconds. Someone from, I think that's the Pensway, is saying that if we follow the Dodd-Franks and then the EU and we continue in this process, we will have cholesterol of all these regulations. And they have also questioned they have also questioned the how this law will actually penalize those who may not go by it, and maybe we should be careful in raising a red flag, as Lotte herself said, that it appears there are positive and negative, or even neutral. The law may not even have an impact, as she introduced. But at this juncture, I want to give anyone who has something that is not yet on the chat room, or if you want to respond to anything, this is the time. We have barely 5 minutes to use for that. You can raise your hand. I think that option is still possible. And then Boyan, who is sitting in Canada and helping us with all this technology, will let you in for a quick question. Does anybody have a question?
No, while we're waiting, while we're waiting for a question,
sure.
Looking at the chat, there was a comment from Mark Hummel about UAE, and it says the vast majority of African ASM gold is exported to UAE. Is it not also the UAE level that we should discuss part of the solution? Absolutely, 100% correct. And that's why a law was passed in the summer of 2018 on AML and CFT, and also covering responsible supply chain. That was disseminated through the market in 2019, would have been implemented in 2020, but we had the pandemic. And so this year, that law has been implemented. And this is at regulating and controlling the flow of gold into the UAE from anywhere, is really subject to strict, draconian regulation. And if people are found not to be following the laws, they will be punished seriously. And so I think I'm not aware of any other place in the world where there are such strict rules. And so Mark was right, and I'm pleased to say that the UAE is actually leading the way in addressing and giving resolution to this in a way that doesn't hurt Africa, because you have to be very careful that the cure doesn't kill the patient. So we have to make sure that we have strict controls in place to make sure illicit gold doesn't happen and that money is not going into the hands of bad people. But also we have to make sure that money goes into the hands of good people, good hardworking people from the artisanal sector that need to get the money due to them and more money due to them. They don't get enough. When I look at gold at $2,000 plus, how much of that money was going down into the artisanal sector? I can tell you, not much. So I think, I hope that answers the question about UAE. Jerry, do you want to say something to that quickly?
Very, very, very briefly.
Okay.
I think the UAE is now the only physical gold market in the world which is regulated.
Correct. Frank.
Yeah, no, this is not with you. I thought you had finished. I wanted to come in respond to Feta Simon. Feta Simon asked a question saying, since mineral-based conflicts are armed in nature, how does EU law intend to handle end users' arms diversion while protecting private companies accredited by EU in mineral business in Africa? If there is anybody or Lotte or want to attempt, but it is a good question because I think, like I said earlier on, we need to bring up this question within the framework of EU-AU dialogue. The Agenda 23 has had a target of silencing the guns on the continent by 2020. And I kept on telling my colleagues at the African Union that we cannot do this if we cannot silence guns in conflict zones, in resource zones, resource corridors. So this is a good, whether this recommendation, we can bring it within this law to say, okay, how can we embed trading in arms, illicit of arms, and proliferation of small arms. In 2000, working with the people, Planet and People and Amnesty International and Campaign Against Arms Trade in the UK, we raised an issue of trading arms in Africa and the damage it does. We found out that an arms broker needs a license. While an AK-7 in the northern Uganda was costing as little as a chicken. So there are so many arms on the continent. And if we cannot tackle issue of arms trade itself and how it is easy to bring these arms in, then we may not end the conflicts. And if we don't get the conflicts, we won't end the laws. But I think this is an issue that we can put forward for discussion within an EU-AU strategic framework. And as I'm still at the African Union, I could always put it within the framework of AU policy decision discussions. But Lotte, if you want to talk something about it, please.
Okay, over to you, Lotte.
Yeah, no, I do not have much to add because the EU regulation doesn't touch upon the arms issues. So it will be included in other regulatory measures, but not in the EU responsible sourcing regulation. And just to maybe on the question of Dodd-Frank versus EU regulation and what kind of measures should be followed, I think, yeah, just to summarize, the Dodd-Frank and EU regulation are quite different for companies. So for companies, it makes a difference. However, I think on the ground for producing countries, there's not much difference. So the difference is really on how to do the reporting. So the Dodd-Frank has a lot of emphasis on the reporting. And I think generally, yeah, like I said before, there was a question, what should we follow then in Africa? I think because there's all these different regulations, China might come up with something. I think it is, yeah, safest to say that the OECD due diligence guidance can be seen as a general guideline, which is, like I said, also followed by, for example, the LBMA. It's a and also Dodd-Frank EU regulation, China Chambers of Commerce. So I think that if we have to look for one overlapping general guidelines, I think the OECD due diligence guidance would be it.
Can I add, sorry, Lottie, can I just,
Yes.
sorry guys to cut in. You make a really good point. And you're inferring like an international approach, because there you say Dodd-Frank, we've got the OECD, we've got EU, we've got China's going to do something. You know, what this industry needs is one standard. In diamonds, there's the Kimberley process. Everyone understands it. Everyone follows, or not everyone, but you know, there's one standard, not multiple standards. So, you know, for me, what I'd be doing here is develop African African Minerals Association. Definitely, I think Jerry's a great point there, not just gold, but then globally get together and have an international body made up of key parties, made up of OECD, made up of LBMA, made up of people from Dubai and from Africa. Then you get everyone, and you got one standard. You know, we got one set of laws, not multiple, and then we follow it, and we make sure, Frank, that Africa has its input. That you, at the end of, once these rules are produced and finished, and everyone's going to follow, you've had an equal say at the table as anyone anywhere else in the world. And I think that's all you're asking for.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. Thank you. If all the other speakers or the participants have any question that is not answered yet, I realize Loite was answering most of the chat questions already. So if anybody has any other questions, you may want to forward it to Boyan, and then we can bring this meeting to a close. I'd like to actually thank everybody for participating. I said the floor was open for participants to ask their questions, but I haven't seen any. I think it's not possible for people to raise their hands. Boyan, you can help. But I see Frank's hand up, so I will see for a minute. Mr. Mujani, you have the mic.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on, you know, that international standard, which Jeff and Lottie referred to, which also in line with the question that was put by Evans Ruvara regarding regionalizing the database is a great idea. However, I wonder what use this is for when there is a vacuum in terms of policy integration as far as trade of the 3 Ts is concerned. Could you help us know what is being done in terms of integration, harmonization of standardization of policy frameworks and regulatory instruments as to ensure that certification processes are successful? That's a very important and critical point. And that's why MADI and our partners, including Jeff and others, were trying to put together an African Precious Minerals and Metals Association to work on having a continental, so that when we start engaging with the EU and China and India, we are not going in as 55 states. We cannot continue doing it, you know, fragmented as 55 states, or as the Great Lakes region, or as East African community, or as ECOWAS. We need to have a standardization in terms of policy regulation for Africa that then engages with the rest of the world, because USA is 50 states united in one. United Kingdom is 3 or 4 states united in one. Europe is about whatever, 27, 37 united in one. And then we have China, we have India, we have Asia. So we need as Africa to have a framework through which we come together, to put our voice together and push this dialogue forward. That's why I'm saying we have a platform, we have a medium through which we can exchange are referring to the EU-Africa joint strategy that is still going on from 2017 for the next 10 years. So we have a room where we could do this, but we need to organize ourselves as Africans in order to get there. Thank you.
I would just like to finally, Frank, just mention one detail on this two numbers. You just gave a lot of numbers. Jeff and Frank also gave it before. And Raymond gave it before. If Africa, artisanal mining produces 420 tons of gold, out of, in total, first and primary gold production a year, call it 5,000, then you are nearly 20% of the world's gold. So if you refine that and make these 20% value added products out of Africa, the African continent will thrive dramatically. We don't have to send it to Switzerland.
Correct. Very correct. Value added in Africa. Seriously, look, Africa can flourish, sorry to say, without the EU. You know, it's more, it should look, the real world of physical gold is from Turkey eastwards. The real world of physical gold. Okay, you look at where the demand is. Okay, now why can't Africa be creating the value add that comes into Africa from selling to China, but value added, selling jewelry? Why? Why not?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Okedi, did you want to say something?
Before Jacob comes in, Ray,
okay.
on Jeffrey's point of China having a demand of 1,000 tons annually in 2019. I mean, having a demand of 1,000 tons. And for goodness sake, we are 1.3 billion people. Why can we not create and establish bullions in Africa, establish jewelry production centers? Why can't we create demand? If you can't create demand for yourself, you cannot determine the price. We're not going to argue because the demand determines the price. So Africa, through Continental Free Trade Area, we need to really look and see how our central governments, our central banks, and start rethinking of how do we create demand on the African continent for the gold, rather than actually thinking of the rest. But at least we can increase, gradually to reach at least 500 until we get there. But we need to start thinking about creating demand in Africa.
Right, but you don't need the EU, Frank. You don't need it. If the EU, you say, blah, 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 this rule, that rule, you don't need them, fine. Forget it, we'll sell our gold somewhere else.
Thank you very much. Mr. Okedi, I think you wanted to contribute. The mic is yours.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah, we can.
All right, thank you. I wanted to just make an observation and maybe a recommendation at the same time. I noticed that all these initiatives we're having, like MADI and perhaps others, are very well intentioned, and the objects therein are very clear. But there's a challenge that we have realized within Africa and in the region is that most of the people fronting or championing these initiatives work independently, and there is not a collaborative effort to harmonize the objectives of the outcomes we intend. For example, the ICGL are member countries. When the Dodd-Frank Act got passed in the US, through their SEC, they wrote to the African nations and gave so many conditions as to the way and manner in which we can trade. And we, at the regional committee, which guides the whole process, we sat down, discussed as member states, and we also drafted a response, of course, for the heads of state to consider and see how they can submit through the high-level fora. However, the outcome of that was that eventually there was a recommendation to develop a model law. We have a model law which has been revised over time to take in consideration the interests of African countries at large, but specifically the 3 TG producing countries that are members of the ICGLR. And that model law is informing the revision of the policy frameworks and the legislation that we think is catering for the conditions and the situation within the member states and Africa at large, with initiatives such as the African Mining Vision and such. So I would think that the other initiatives like MADI, through their collaborations, could liaise with such already ongoing processes, and we see how we can bring this matter to some kind of positive, positive impact, as it is the intention of the whole of our discussion today and other development partners or other interest groups in the sector. That's just the contribution I wanted to make. Thank you, and nice evening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Okedi, and I would like to thank everybody else. I think we've exhausted the topic today. We have a lot of wisdom we will distill, and then within a week come up with some kind of document, and we'll share it with every other person. And so with that, I would like to say thank you and have a good evening, afternoon, morning, wherever you are. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye, Frank.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Bye.